everybody. Good to see you. It may appear that I'm alone, but that's only because you can't see what's happening behind the cameras. Right now, Clint has selected his beverage of choice.
Hey, Bible study. Sorry. Running behind.
No, we just, we're trying to get ready for what is a very quickly coming Holy Week.
Yeah, it's on the way. Palm Sunday, and
yeah, it's going to be good.
Thanks for joining us on this beautiful, but pretty beautiful Monday. Somewhat beautiful. The wind's a little cold in the shadows. If you're out in the sun, it's nice.
I was going to say today seems to me to be an upper of a day.
45?
Yeah.
It's not.
It's a pretty good day.
Yeah, you don't write home about it, but it's pretty good.
Carolyn, I need to probably talk with you at some point today. I have a question for you. So we'll try and make that happen.
Hi, Becky. Yeah, hope everybody had a good weekend. Anything exciting? Weekend report from the Gweckys?
It was my nephew's birthday and my mother-in-law's birthday. So we celebrated that. And I had very above average cake. I mean, really good.
This was someone made it?
Yeah. My sister, Rochelle's youngest sister, was in charge of the birthday desserts. And it was kind of like a yellow cake, but she infused it with something that made it like really rich, and it had kind of a creamy. You know how cakes can sometimes
pudding mix? Sometimes there's pudding mix in cakes.
There was something that really kicked up the moisture content, and then she put like a caramel crumble on top. So you had like the spongy yellow cake, and then it was good.
You're not a guy who raves about desserts that often. That's pretty impressive.
It stuck out for me.
That's impressive because I don't consider you like a giant cake fan. You have to make a cake pretty bad before I'm not excited about it. But you're less on the cake team.
That's fair. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's 100% fair. I will say. And I can't take any credit for this. My wife was responsible for purchasing my nephew his birthday present, and she selected a. Well, I should say this. He's 4 now. So.
Oh yeah, that's fun. Something loud and obnoxious.
Well, we've done that before, but this year she got him an astronaut suit, so it was like shiny, like had like a shiny helmet. And he put that on, and he was like beaming like sunshine. It was fun to watch.
That's pretty good.
So
that's pretty good, huh? Cake and astronaut suits. That seems like a good weekend.
Nah, he did pretty well.
Hi, Mark.
He had a good birthday. What about the levels? Anything interesting? Yeah, you did have something interesting.
Well, yeah, we had a pretty good weekend. We took off for Mankato on Saturday morning. Emma had some scrimmage games. Bailey and Peter were able to bring John down and met us, so we got to hang out, watch some volleyball, then eat dinner with the whole family, which was nice. So pretty easy drive. You know, that hour and a half drive is just it's really convenient, and the fact that they can meet us down there it was really good. It was fun to be together. They had a little time in between games, and from where the field house is, you walk across the street, and there's a little strip mall there's Insomnia cookies and of Chipotle and a Panera. No, not a Panera. A Caribou coffee and a whatever. And so we didn't really eat lunch, but we got to take little John over and just kind of graze. I think he got his first exposure to a sugar cookie, which he seemed to, and we didn't do it. That was all his dad did that, so we are not blamed for that. But you know, it's one of the, I love babies when they encounter stuff. That first bite was like, and then he was like all in, like, hey, this is way better than mashed up.
I'll take a little bit more of that.
This is way better than mashed up peas.
Could you please pass along the sugary goodness?
Yes,
that's hilarious.
Yeah, it was fun.
Good for him.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, when the Lovell family is all in position to eat together, What is the sort of genres of choice? Are you trying to find a pizza place, or what's sort of your
No,
take on that?
yeah, we're pretty all over the place. We like to try new stuff. Generally, we are interested in places we haven't already been.
Yeah.
As Emma had played, 6 games, 10 games of volleyball, whatever, she got to picked it was called the Boulder Tap House, Boulder Burger House.
I've eaten in one of these.
Which I think is a chain.
Yeah,
And
I've eaten in one of those.
And it was good. It wasn't amazing.
Right.
It was good.
Yeah.
That's where she wanted to go. So we generally end up someplace, sandwiches and choices, or somewhere quirky that we've heard about, and go try it out.
This is going to seem really odd. Was that like somewhat kitty corner to a home improvement store? Boulder Tap House?
There was a Home Depot across the road
Okay. I ate at that restaurant.
in Mankato.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
It was good. It was kind of like a Buffalo Wild Wings type-ish
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
They made their own chips as an appetizer, so we had like their in the kitchen made salt and vinegar potato chips, which are a little thicker than
Yeah.
they were good.
Okay.
They were really good.
This
Really
this
good.
isn't going to surprise
I'd
you.
eat hundreds of them.
I have not had a consistently strong experience with homemade chips. I feel like
Oh.
not every restaurant can pull that off. And
Yeah,
if you
no,
get
fair.
bad chips, you just wish I would have rather had Lay's, right? I mean, I don't know. That's my opinion. You could disagree. Tell me in the chat if you disagree.
I can't remember the name. Bailey and Peter have a place close to them that does their own chips, and I would say that the only ones I've had better than Saturday were those.
Okay.
They were really good.
You've had consistently...
I think I'm not picky though. You fry a potato, I'm probably gonna like it.
You've had consistently high ratings for the food by Bailey and Peter, from what I've heard. Or maybe you've just withheld some bad experiences. But it seems like you've thought pretty highly of the food over there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. They are in an area that's sort of Okoboji-ish, but just bigger because
Okay.
it's an extension of Minneapolis. It's a huge lake, and it's kind of highbrow. There are communities around the lake that are fairly highbrow, and so they're in pretty close proximity to a lot of, I think, kind of pretty good restaurants.
Right.
So at least what we've eaten, we've enjoyed. I'm not a picky eater,
Okay. Last question from me today. When you go out for a nice meal to whatever restaurant you consider nice, is there a dish that you order that's sort of like a treat yourself kind of dish? Do you order a steak, or do you order, I'm trying to think, lobster? What else would you order? Do you order, something that's outside of your ordinary, but you say, I get this when I go to the nice place?
So I'm not a chef by any stretch, Michael, but I'm a reasonably decent cook. I enjoy cooking. I try different things. So the things that I like are things that I don't think I could tackle.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
if somebody's going to make their own pasta and they, make it, that's the kind of stuff. I make pretty decent homemade pizza. I make the crust. I make a steak. I mean, a good steak is hard to beat, but you can grill
Right.
a pretty good steak at home. And I tend maybe my Iowa roots, I tend to be a pork guy. So if you had me choose between a really good pork chop and a really good steak, I would pick pork chop most of the time.
Huh. There you go.
So I just like stuff that's done well. I don't really have a go-to. It's kind of, I like burgers, but again, you can.
Yeah.
Burgers are hard to make stand out because
They are.
there's a pretty good burger almost anywhere you go.
I would argue.
The place up, you gotta do so. The burger is how you trick it up. like the place uptown that does
Yeah.
the fried pickles and the coleslaw.
Yeah.
I mean, the burger's a burger, kind of.
I would argue that's similar in the pizza genre. That there are a lot of pretty good pizzas, but to make it a great pizza, you've got to really push the limit a little bit.
Yeah. I think a decent burger is better than a decent pizza.
Really? Because
In
I
other
think
words,
some
I
people.
think the middle ground on burger is higher.
I would only give you that if you would give me that people like then cheaper pizza than they like cheaper burgers. Because I think there's a whole genre of pizza.
Yeah,
Like the
that's fair.
whole frozen pizza genre, people will love that. But then they'll also want to go get the high tone pizza with the mozzarella and the fresh mozzarella and
I think maybe what I'm saying is I think the difference between average and good pizza is bigger than the window between an average and good burger.
Oh, okay.
I think that's what I mean.
Okay.
Like you can, I don't know. I don't know what I mean. I don't even know what I'm saying.
I'm now reflecting on where this conversation has gone, and I just apologize to all of you for having heard 10 minutes of Michael and Clint's opinions. So how about we...
it's heavy on food talk today.
Yeah, no kidding. Good to have you here, everybody. Thank you for weathering that, and we'll see you on the other side.
Welcome back with us as we start another week, working our way through Timothy, coming to a close today in the first chapter, bringing that chapter to an end as we jump in verse 18. A pretty significant switch of directions, but an interesting passage here. So I'm going to go ahead and just read all the way through the end of the chapter here, just 2 or 3 verses, and then we'll stop and talk about it. I'm giving you these instructions, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies made earlier about you, so that by following them you may fight the good fight, having faith and a good conscience. By rejecting conscience, certain people have suffered shipwreck in their faith. Among them, Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have turned over to Satan, so they may learn not to blaspheme. So, you're going to see this throughout the book, these little moments where Paul says something encouraging to Timothy, kind of a stay the course, fight the good fight. That's going to come up again. We're going to see that phrase again later. It is kind of partly it's the way Paul writes, and partly it's the purpose of this letter. He's writing to Timothy to kind of spur him on and encourage him as a leader. And so we don't know a great deal. This isn't the last we'll hear about it, but we don't know a great deal about what the prophecies were. But it seems clear that at some point, Timothy's family dedicated him to service, partnering him with Paul, and Paul is now telling him to sort of live up and live out of that, so that by following, you may fight the good fight. And I think in the church context, Michael, fight the good fight is a really fascinating phrase. In other words, he doesn't tell him that you may do well. He doesn't tell him so that you'll get it right, that you'll be correct. Paul seems to presume that there's going to be struggle in leadership. And I think that's very interesting, that fight is a tough word, but that there is a kind of grinding that happens to be leader, that it's not all smooth sailing, that there is some pushback and there is some struggle and there is perhaps some conflict, and that Timothy needs to fight the good fight. Now, you could read into that lots of stuff. Don't fight the bad fights. Make sure the things you're fighting are, but I just think that's a really interesting way for him to put that.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting not only that he says that, but that it is paired with these earlier words. So let's just remind ourselves of it here when he says, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies made earlier. When you're a young person and prophecies get made over you, inevitably, because of that mixture of youthful optimism and as well as, this idea that someone's speaking this thing that you believe will be true that now, but also even more so into the future. I think there's this sense in which it's easy to glorify what might be. It's easy to live into the glory of the hypothetical. But anybody who has led, and Clint, I think here, to your point, anyone who has worked in that regular process of leadership with people at all, but now more specifically in the church, I think what you'll discover very quickly is that where there are many people, there are many motives. There are certainly many understandings of Scripture and what it means. And as Timothy is now being addressed here, I do think there's a kind of mentor tone that Paul offers, but the quickness by which Paul moves from encouragement to, I think it'd be fair to say, Clint, it's pretty blistering language as it regards these individuals, Hymenaeus and Alexander. I mean, fundamentally, Paul is encouraging Timothy, who received this prophecy, yeah, it's going to be a tough run. And simultaneously, he says, and some people are, they've fallen off the bandwagon and they're in a bad spot. So I do think there's a dual nature kind of thing happening here. And maybe this makes the most sense if you consider the context that you have an older, more mature leader who, by the way, Paul knows something about conflict, right? I mean, clearly, both inside the church and with those forces outside the church. Paul is well aware of the struggle. And so as he shares this with Timothy, I think we can hear in it, maybe a little bit of a reminder that it's not always going to be easy. It's going to take effort.
Yeah, I think you could preach an entire sermon just from verse 19. Fight this good fight, Timothy. And then he goes on, having faith and a good conscience. And it's interesting, the pairing there. Faith to believe in something, to subscribe to something, to accept something, and a good conscience, a good sense of morality, a good system of ethics, a behavior that is connected to that belief. That the way one lives for Paul is an outflowing of their belief, an outflowing of their faith. And so faith should lead to good conscience. And what happens when you get them wrong? Look at the next part here. By rejecting conscience, in other words, by getting the moral, ethical part wrong, by offending conscience, certain persons have suffered a shipwreck in the faith. That fascinating language.
Really?
They have sunk their faith.
Yeah.
Their faith sank because they didn't practice the right moral, ethical things to support it. And it's fascinating that he tells Timothy faith and good conscience, and then goes right on in the next sentence to say, but by bad conscience, you get a bad result in the faith. Yep. And then he's going to go on. We'll cover the people that are named in a moment, but that is a fascinating phrase, and I think there is a deep wisdom there from a discipleship perspective, from a church perspective. If I were reading this, I think if I were in Timothy's shoes and trying to make sense of this is one of the moments where I would think, ooh, Paul knows some stuff.
Yeah.
But there's some depth here.
So this too stuck out to me, Clint. So I looked up here this word that is translated conscience because I was curious what's happening there. So the Greek word is synodasis, and it is translated every time as conscience, and it has that idea of distinguishing between what is morally good and bad. And I find the clarity of that really, really intriguing because, and I know we've mentioned Romans now a number of times in this study, and I somewhat apologize for that, but I feel like it lives very much behind a lot of Paul's writings. It fleshes out some of these things, and his constant return to this idea of law and grace is very much implicit here in this language of conscience, because as he has laid out so clearly, the law teaches us where we go wrong. And the conscience for Paul seems to be in a lot of his writings, I think, very simple. The conscience is a relatively reliable guide. Now, moral ethicists that follow along in the Christian tradition, they've in some ways asked some questions and complexified some of those thoughts. But Paul, at least in my reading of Paul, seems to have a pretty basic understanding that humans by nature generally have a pretty good sense of that discernment between right and wrong. And so the fact that there are some individuals who have rejected that basic sense, that they've turned from what is essentially in the light and they have chosen darkness, is for Paul an inexcusable choice. And the fight in some way appears to be related to this idea of simply living on the right side of conduct, the right side of, not to say the law, but certainly the right side of choice. And it's amazing how simple Paul frames that to be, but yet it's clearly a linchpin. It's important.
Yeah, and again, the language helps us here. We can read the word good as a fairly shallow, maybe even superficial, but in the Greek, that's very close, at least for Paul. I would argue that that's very close to godly. Not just good in some generic sense of simply right and wrong, but deeper than that, the sense of God approved. A good conscience is a conscience and a lifestyle approved by God, and that's what faith leads us to for Paul. And when your conscience leads you astray, the ship of your faith is not seaworthy. It's not carrying you. It's not weathering the storms. It's not avoiding the obstacles. It is destined. It is in danger, and ultimately, it's going to sink. It's not seaworthy. And so, I mean, this idea of a seaworthy faith, it just, I don't know. This is a rich verse, I think, from a sermon perspective or from a discipleship or devotional perspective. There's just a lot there. And then Paul moves from a kind of generic, this is generally true, to very specific examples of what has gone wrong. And he says, among these people are Hymenaeus and Alexander. Now, we only know that these at one point were companions of Paul. They worked with him, or they were in his circle. Something happened here, and he says, whom I have turned over to Satan. And that sounds like a very dramatic kind of phrase to us. It means essentially we expelled them from the community. We told them they are no longer part of the church. They are outside of the community. I've handed them over to Satan. Why? So they may learn not to blaspheme. Notice that the punishment is for their education. It is done in the hope. They are held accountable in the hope that they will, by repentance, return to a good conscience, return to a solid and trustworthy faith. These are texts that are difficult because they do speak to conflict and contention and division in the early church. But I think it's important that Paul, speaking to a young leader, points out that even when those hard decisions have to be made, they're made in the hope that ultimately they might do some good for the people involved.
And this, Clint, is not the only letter where we have a section like this.
Right.
And I want to just point out that Paul, even when he says some very, very hard things about leadership or about a way to interact with someone who's lost their way, note that he is explicit in connecting that to what would be the positive good. So once again here, so that they may learn not to blaspheme. I think that though the harshness of that language may sort of grab our attention, this idea I've taken them over, turned them over to Satan, that may grab our attention. But don't miss that Paul envisions or imagines that this is for the sake of teaching something. And maybe there's some rhetoric in that, and Paul is just speaking harshly. But as we see in other letters, the individual in the Corinthian community who he says needs to be turned out because of his conduct, says for the sake of their ability to be received again, in order for there to be reconciliation, do this action. I think that is a fundamentally Christian conviction that we see Paul instructing Timothy, that even when we do hard things, we do that hard thing for the sake of the one that the hard thing is being done, that God's grace is able to work even in difficult circumstances. I think there's a little bit of preaching in that may not be incredibly close to the text itself, but I think it's powerful, just the fact that even though these individuals get named, Paul has in mind a kind of learning that he hopes for them. And I mean, ultimately, that's the hope of all Christian life, is that we learn somewhere along the way.
Yeah, and I think you want to take a moment to connect this. What did Paul claim of himself? I was brought into the faith even though I was a blasphemer. We saw that in verse. Yeah. We saw that in verse 13, and Paul again. It's very subtle, but what is Paul saying? I recognize blasphemy. I had done it, but I was called to something else and brought into the faith. And when you choose to blaspheme, then by consequence, you also leave the faith. You have a shipwreck in the faith. So I think a really strong passage, a really interesting way to end this chapter. I think some really profound words to a young man who is trying to lead the church. The idea, just from the sort of 100-mile perspective, what do we see about leadership? Fight the good fight. If I were talking to somebody about this verse and they were in leadership, yeah, you're not going to avoid all the battles. Pick the right ones, fight them the right way, stand up for what matters, and do so with a good conscience and a strong faith. I mean, there's a lot to be said here for a young man who is trying to make his way into some leadership, and I think it's a strong way to close out this opening chapter. Starting tomorrow, we begin to change the focus knob a little bit as Paul looks, interestingly, at his world and then at the society they live in, and ultimately narrows that focus down to the church throughout the next couple of chapters. And I think that he'll have a lot to offer, a lot to think about, some stuff that may be a little uncomfortable along the way as well.
Well, I think, friends, that will be it for today. Thanks for being with us. I hope that you've enjoyed this. You will like it. Maybe subscribe if you want to join us for more studies in the future. But that said, we look forward to continuing our study tomorrow. Until then, be blessed.
Thanks.